He left his phone on the kitchen counter at 7:43 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, and that 30-second mistake unraveled 6 years of carefully constructed lies. Isabella DeLuca was loading the dishwasher when she heard it buzz. One notification, one name, Celeste. "I can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Wear the cologne I bought you in Monaco." Isabella's hands went still inside the soapy water. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She just picked up the phone and started reading. What she found in the next 40 minutes didn't just break her heart. It handed her a weapon. If you've ever trusted someone completely, given them everything, and discovered it was all a beautiful, deliberate lie, then you already know exactly what Isabella felt standing in that kitchen with her 6-month belly pressing against the counter and her husband's secret life glowing in her hands. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a story like this one, because the truth Isabella uncovered goes so much deeper than an affair. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you believe a woman like Isabella deserves justice, hit that like button before we go any further. Now, let's go back to where it all began to fall apart. The house smelled like roasted turkey and brown sugar, and the kind of warmth that fools you into thinking everything is fine. Isabella had spent 3 days preparing for Thanksgiving. Not because Lorenzo asked her to. He never asked her to do anything domestic, considered it beneath the household staff to let her cook at all. But this year she had insisted. She was 6 months pregnant, her ankles were swollen, and something deep and stubborn in her wanted to make a real meal with her own hands. She wanted to feel normal. She wanted one night where the word Moretti wasn't attached to a fear, and the word DeLuca wasn't attached to power, and she was just a woman feeding her family. Their dining room table could seat 20. Tonight there were only 4. Lorenzo at the head, his younger brother Marco across from Isabella, and Gia, Marco's wife, who spent most of dinner complimenting the centerpiece and carefully avoiding eye contact with her brother-in-law. Gia had always been good at that. Surviving in this family required a specific kind of practiced blindness, and Gia had perfected it long before Isabella ever walked through the front door. Lorenzo was distracted all evening. Isabella noticed it the way you notice a draft. Not immediately, but gradually. A slow, cold thing that makes you pull your sleeves down without quite understanding why. He checked his watch twice during the appetizers. He laughed too loudly at Marco's joke about the wine, the laugh that didn't reach his eyes, the performance laugh. He ate quickly, cutting his turkey in clean, efficient strokes, like a man moving through obligation. "You barely touched the stuffing," Isabella said quietly. He looked up. For just a moment, one unguarded half-second, something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Then the smile came. The smooth, reliable smile that had charmed her across a charity gala 6 years ago, and still, even now, made something in her chest go soft against her will. "It's perfect," he said. "Everything's perfect, Bella." She hated when he called her Bella. She had told him that once, early in the marriage, because her father had called her that, and her father was gone, and it hurt to hear it from someone else's mouth. Lorenzo had apologized and then kept doing it anyway. Small things like that. She had filed them away for years without understanding what they meant. Marco poured more wine. Gia talked about their daughter's school play. The candles burned lower. Outside, November pressed cold and dark against the windows, and Isabella sat at her own table feeling like a guest. Then Lorenzo's phone, face up beside his water glass, lit up. He reached for it before she could see the screen, but she caught the name. Just the name. Celeste. He stood up so smoothly it was almost beautiful. "Business," he said, already walking. "I'm sorry, give me 20 minutes. He kissed her on the top of her head, a gesture that in any other marriage might have been tender, and disappeared toward his office down the hall. Marco and Gia pretended not to notice. That was the thing about the people in Lorenzo's life. They had all become very skilled at not noticing. Isabella cut a small piece of turkey she didn't eat. She listened to the distant murmur of his voice behind the office door. Too low to make out words, but she could hear the rhythm of it, and the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't the clipped cadence he used for business. It was slower, warmer. 20 minutes became 40. When Lorenzo finally returned to the table, he was slightly flushed, and his left shirt cuff had been rebuttoned incorrectly, 2 holes up from where it should be. He didn't notice. He sat down, refilled his water glass, and said something charming to Marco about football. Isabella looked at his cuff and said nothing. The evening ended the way all their evenings ended lately, politely, quietly, with a performance of closeness rather than closeness itself. Marco and Gia left before 10. The staff cleared the dishes. Lorenzo mentioned an early morning meeting, kissed her forehead again, and went upstairs. Isabella stood in the kitchen alone, running warm water over her hands for no reason, just needing something to do with them. And then she saw it. His phone. On the counter beside the toaster, screen dark, abandoned. He'd set it down when he came back from his office and walked upstairs without it. She stood looking at it for a long time. The thing about Isabella Moretti DeLuca was that she had never been a jealous woman. Not because she was naive, or her father had run one of the most powerful legitimate shipping empires on the East Coast. And she had grown up understanding that powerful men attracted dangerous attention of every kind. She wasn't jealous because she had always believed, genuinely believed, that Lorenzo had chosen her. Not her family's connections, not the Moretti name. Her. That belief had carried her through a lot. Through the long absences and the cold dinners and the nights he came home smelling like airport and cigarettes and something unnamed. Through the first year of marriage when she'd cried herself to sleep 3 times a week and told herself it was adjustment. Through the miscarriage no one outside their household knew about. Through the slow, careful process of learning to love a man who kept most of himself behind glass. She picked up his phone. Her thumb hovered. Lorenzo DeLuca did not have a passcode on his personal phone. He never had. It was one of the few things that had always made her feel secure, the quiet evidence of a man with nothing to hide. The screen unlocked on her first touch. The message thread with Celeste Romano opened automatically because it was the most recent conversation, because it was always the most recent conversation, because apparently it had been the most recent conversation for the better part of 3 years. The most recent message: I can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Wear the cologne I bought you in Monaco. Sent at 7:41 p.m. 2 minutes before Isabella heard it buzz. She scrolled up. She told herself she would stop after a few messages. She told herself she would put the phone down, go upstairs, sleep, deal with whatever this was in the morning when she had her bearings. She told herself a dozen reasonable things as she stood in the kitchen in her stocking feet with their unborn son pressing against her ribs. She did not stop. The thread went back 26 months. 26 months of messages that began professionally. She could see where the shift happened, could date it almost to the week. A Tuesday in September 3 years ago, when "let me know if the Monaco account cleared" became "I keep thinking about last night," and then became something that made Isabella's throat close completely. You are the only thing I've ever wanted that I let myself keep waiting for. I know, but it's almost time. Just a little longer. She doesn't know you the way I do. Nobody does, Sel. Nobody does. Isabella read that message 3 times. She read it until the letters blurred and then sharpened again. She noticed distantly that her hands were not shaking. She expected them to shake. Instead, they were very still, the way her hands had been when she was 12 years old, and her father told her that her mother wasn't coming back from the hospital. She kept scrolling. There were photographs. She did not look at them long enough to understand what they were, long enough to register several locations she recognized. The suite at the Fontaine in Chicago that Lorenzo had claimed to use for business meetings. The terrace of a villa in Amalfi, where he'd told her his phone died and that was why he'd been unreachable for 2 days. A restaurant in Paris she had never been to, but that had candles on the tables and a view of the river, and Celeste Romano was laughing in the photograph with the easy, open laugh of a woman who believes she is loved. Celeste Romano. Isabella knew the name, not well, not intimately. She was a name from before. From the years before Isabella, the woman Lorenzo had dated seriously in his late 20s before whatever ended them ended them. She was the name that came up once at a dinner party 3 years ago and caused Lorenzo's jaw to tighten almost imperceptibly before he redirected the conversation. She was the woman Isabella had told herself was history. She was not history. She was, if the messages from the past 26 months were accurate, she was the present. She was the ongoing. She was the parallel story running beneath Isabella's marriage like an underground river. Isabella set the phone face down on the counter. She breathed. She was 6 months pregnant. Her feet hurt. She had spent 3 days cooking a meal for a man who was planning, in messages dated as recently as last Tuesday, to ease Isabella out of the picture once the baby was born. Those were the words, ease her out, like removing a splinter, carefully, minimally, so as not to make a mess. It'll be easier after, Lorenzo had written. The baby gives her something to focus on. She won't fight as hard if she thinks she's protecting the kid. Isabella read that message, and something in her went very quiet and very cold. She picked the phone back up. She read for another hour. She read until she understood not just the affair. The affair was almost simple, almost something she could have survived. But the architecture of what Lorenzo and Celeste had been building together. The slow, strategic dismantling of her position in the De Luca family. The conversations about financial rerouting, the phrase the Moretti accounts appearing in a way that made her stomach drop. Because those accounts weren't Lorenzo's, they were hers, inherited from her father. And the fact that they were being discussed in this thread meant Lorenzo had been planning something with those funds that had nothing to do with her knowledge or consent. Her father's advisor, Adrian Vescari, 63 years old, the man who had known her since she was born and managed the Moretti holdings through her father's illness and death, had called her twice in the past month to discuss what he called some irregularities. She had not pushed him on it. She had assumed it was administrative, the kind of thing Lorenzo handled. She understood now why Adrian had sounded careful on the phone. He hadn't wanted to alarm her without proof. I was a man who understood that in families like this one, you did not make accusations without something solid in your hand. Isabella looked at the phone. She had something solid now. She pulled her own phone from her cardigan pocket, opened her Photos app, and began, methodically, to photograph every message, every image, every financial figure that appeared in the thread. Her hands were still steady. She didn't understand why they were steady. Later, she would think that the body sometimes understands before the mind does, that this is not the moment to fall apart. She photographed for 40 minutes. When she was done, she had 237 photographs. Then she opened the voice memo application on Lorenzo's phone and found what she found there. Because of course the phone was unlocked, of course he'd never imagined she would look, because men like Lorenzo De Luca build their lives on the assumption that the people who love them will not look too closely. She found 6 voice recordings. 2 of them were mundane. The other 4 were phone calls Lorenzo had recorded himself, a habit she hadn't known about, and in one of them, a call from 8 weeks ago, she heard her husband's voice say, clearly and without any detectable guilt, "She's too trusting. She's always been too trusting. It's going to make this clean." The person on the other end of the call laughed, not Celeste. A man's voice, one she didn't recognize. "And the Moretti transfer?" the man's voice asked. "Pending," Lorenzo said, "after the birth. It has to look voluntary." Isabella stopped the recording. She stood in her kitchen on Thanksgiving night, 6 months pregnant, in the house she had moved into, believing it was her home, and she understood something with a clarity that was almost physical, a kind of cold light that came on behind everything. She was not a wife. She had not been a wife for a long time. She was a piece on a board. She was a name on documents. She was the mother of a child who was going to be used as a reason to keep her quiet, while the man she had loved dismantled everything her father had built and handed it to someone else. She put Lorenzo's phone exactly where she'd found it, on the counter beside the toaster, face down, precisely the same angle. She went to the refrigerator and poured herself a glass of cold water. She drank it standing at the sink, looking at the window, at her own reflection in the dark glass, swollen and tired and barefoot in her own kitchen, and she thought about her father. Domenico Moretti, who had built an empire with patience and precision and the understanding that power was not about volume, it was about timing. Her father, who had told her once, when she was 16 and furious about something small and forgotten, "Isabella, the most dangerous thing you can ever do to an enemy is let them believe you haven't figured out what they are." She set the glass down. She went upstairs to bed. She lay beside her husband in the dark and listened to him breathe and did not sleep. She did not cry either, not yet. That would come later, in a shower, with the water running loud enough to cover the sound, and it would be the last time she cried about Lorenzo De Luca for a very long while. For now, she just lay still and thought. She thought about Adrian Vescari and what exactly he had found in those accounts. She thought about this voice on the recording she didn't recognize. She thought about the word voluntary and what it meant in the context of a transfer and a birth, and a woman being eased out like a splinter. She thought about her son, because she knew already, had known for 2 months, that she was having a son. And she thought about what kind of world she was going to hand him. And somewhere in the dark, between 3 and 4 in the morning, with Lorenzo's breathing slow and even beside her and the November wind moving through the old oaks outside and their unborn child pressing steady against her ribs, Isabella Moretti De Luca made a decision. She was not going to confront Lorenzo. Not yet. Not here. Not like this. She was going to be patient. She was going to be precise. She was going to be, for exactly as long as it took, exactly what he believed she already was, too trusting. And while he believed that, she was going to take everything she needed. She made breakfast at 7. That was the first thing. Lorenzo came downstairs in his gray robe, hair still damp from the shower, and found Isabella at the stove with eggs in the pan and coffee already poured, and the expression on his face was one she catalogued carefully. A flicker of surprise, then relief, then the warm smile sliding into place like a key turning in a lock. "You didn't sleep in," he said. "Couldn't get comfortable." She handed him the coffee without looking up from the pan. The baby was moving all night. Lorenzo put his hand on her lower back. She did not flinch. She had spent the 4 hours before dawn practicing not flinching. "You should rest," he said. He kissed the side of her head. "I'll be back by 8 tonight. We can watch something." "That sounds nice," she said. He left at 7:40. She watched his car pull down the driveway from the kitchen window, and then she went to the pantry, sat down on the step stool she kept there for reaching the high shelves, and let herself shake for exactly 3 minutes. She timed it. 3 minutes of sitting in the dark between the olive oil and the pasta, with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, while her body did what it needed to do. Then she stood up, splashed cold water on her face at the kitchen sink, and called Adrian Viscari. He picked up on the second ring. "Isabella." His voice had that quality it always had, like old leather, worn and reliable. "I wasn't expecting you this early." "I need to see you today," she said. "Not the office. Somewhere else." A pause. Not a long one. Adrian Viscari had worked for her father for 31 years, and he understood, the way men who have survived in difficult proximity to power always understand, what it meant when someone changed the location of a meeting. "The place on Clement Street," he said. "The bakery. Noon." "I'll be there." She hung up and stood in her kitchen and looked at the room around her. The marble countertops Lorenzo had chosen, the pendant lights she'd picked from a catalog in what felt like another life. The family photographs on the refrigerator held up by magnets from cities she'd visited, most of them alone while Lorenzo was in meetings or elsewhere, or wherever he had been. The photographs were recent enough that she was smiling in most of them. She looked at her own face in those photographs and tried to remember what that felt like, smiling for a camera in a kitchen that still felt like home. She stopped looking. She had things to do. The first thing was the filing cabinet in the basement. Lorenzo believed she never went into the basement because she had mentioned once, early in the marriage, that the lighting down there gave her headaches. In fact, she had no such sensitivity. She had simply found early on that there were spaces in this house Lorenzo mentally assigned to himself, and she had learned to leave those spaces alone, to let him believe he had rooms she didn't enter. What she had not done was fail to notice what was in them. The filing cabinet was locked. She had known that for 3 years. What Lorenzo did not know was that she had found the key 18 months ago inside the spine of an accounting ledger on the shelf above the cabinet, tucked in there with what she imagined he considered cleverness, and had held on to that knowledge the way you hold on to a card you don't play until the hand demands it. She brought a canvas tote bag from the kitchen. She went downstairs. The cabinet had 4 drawers. She started at the bottom. What she found in the next hour and 20 minutes rewired her understanding of the past 3 years in ways that made the affair almost secondary. There were formation documents for 6 companies she had never heard of, all of them registered in Delaware or Nevada, all of them with Lorenzo listed as the sole officer. There were wire transfer records, printed and annotated in Lorenzo's handwriting, moving money between accounts in amounts that would not individually trigger reporting requirements, but that collectively, she did the rough arithmetic standing under the basement's fluorescent lights, totaled somewhere between $4 and $6 million over 22 months. And there were 2 documents she had to read 3 times before she absorbed what they said. Amendments to her father's original business trust, signed with her name, on dates when she had not signed anything. Her signature, on documents she had never seen. She sat down on the basement floor because her legs were not reliable anymore. The documents were good. Whoever had done them had been careful. The signature was close, very close, close enough that she stared at it for a long time, trying to find the place where it wasn't her. She found it eventually. The second loop in the capital I. She always closed it. The forged signature left it slightly open. She put everything in the tote bag. All of it. Then she went upstairs, changed her clothes, and drove to meet Adrian. The bakery on Clement Street was the kind of place that had been there for 40 years, and would be there for 40 more. Red check tablecloths, a glass case of pastries that nobody bought because everyone came for the coffee, and a back corner booth that her father had used for exactly this kind of conversation because the owner, a woman named Rosa, who was 70 years old and completely indifferent to the affairs of anyone who wasn't her family, ran it without security cameras. Adrian was already there when Isabella arrived. He was a small man, compact and careful the way her father had been careful, with white hair cut close and eyes the color of old denim that missed very little. He stood when she came in, which he always did, an old courtesy she had always appreciated, and then he looked at her face and did not ask how she was doing. They sat. Rosa brought coffee without being asked. Isabella put the tote bag on the seat beside her. She did not open it yet. "Tell me about the irregularities," she said. Adrian wrapped both hands around his cup. "I didn't want to come to you with speculation. Come to me with it anyway." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, 3 of the Moretti operating accounts have been accessed through a secondary authorization that I don't recognize. Not removed, restructured. The ownership pathway has been altered to route through a holding company I can't find registration for. It's subtle. It took me 6 weeks to see it because whoever did it understood how your father set up the system." "Lorenzo understood how my father set up the system," Isabella said. Adrian said nothing. "Because I explained it to him," she said. "In the first year. He was so interested in my father's methods. He asked such good questions." She picked up her coffee, put it down. "I thought it was admiration." "Isabella?" "He forged my signature," she said. She pulled the 2 trust amendment documents from the tote bag and laid them on the table. "These dates, I was in Connecticut with my sister both those weekends. I have photographs. I have hotel receipts." Adrian put on his reading glasses. He looked at the documents for a long time. When he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who has been suspecting something and still, when it's confirmed, feels the weight of it land. "How did you get these?" he asked quietly. "The filing cabinet in the basement." "He kept them in the house?" "He thought I'd never look." She watched Adrian's face. "He had reasons to think that. I gave him those reasons deliberately for the past 3 years without knowing I was doing it." She paused. "I was a very convincing, trusting wife." Adrian took his glasses off. He set them on the table with a precise, controlled movement. "What else did you find?" She laid out the rest. The company formation documents, the wire transfer records, the annotated figures. Adrian went through them piece by piece with the methodical attention of a man who had spent decades reading financial documents, and Isabella watched his jaw tighten incrementally with each page, a slow accumulation of controlled fury that reminded her so specifically of her father that her chest ached. 6 companies, Adrian said. "That I found. There may be more." "The transfers." He turned one of the annotated pages toward her and pointed. "This routing number, I know this bank. It's the same institution your father used for certain sensitive accounts. The ones that don't appear in the main trust documentation." Isabella was very still. "The reserve accounts." "Yes. Those were sealed when my father died. Nobody outside the immediate family was supposed to have access to that routing number." "Nobody was," Adrian said. They looked at each other across the red check tablecloth. "He's been planning this longer than I thought," Isabella said. "It appears so." "How long?" Adrian's mouth pressed flat. "If I'm reading these transfer dates correctly, and I believe I am, the earliest activity is from approximately 4 months after your wedding." 4 months. She had been 4 months married. She had been so in love at 4 months that she had still been waking up sometimes in the night, just to look at him sleeping, unable to believe her luck. She had been that woman, that open and unguarded woman, while her husband was already drawing the map of how to take everything she had. She picked up her coffee again. This time she drank it. "I need everything documented," she said, "formally. Every irregularity, every unauthorized access, Every transaction that touches the Moretti accounts. I need it in a format that can be presented to a board. Adrian studied her. Isabella, if you move on this without being completely protected, I know. He has connections that go outside what's on paper. If he believes you're building a case before you're ready to act, I know that too. Then you understand that the moment he suspects anything, you are not safe in that house. The word landed between them. Safe. She hadn't thought about it in those specific terms yet, had been operating on something more like focused momentum. But the word settled on her now, and she let it settle, let herself understand what Adrian was telling her. That this was not just a legal problem or a financial problem, but a physical one. That the man whose child she was carrying was a man whose industry had certain methods for inconvenient complications. How long do you need, she asked, to document everything properly? Adrian calculated. 3 weeks, perhaps 4. You have 2. She put the documents back in the tote bag. And Adrian. She waited until he met her eyes. You cannot tell anyone. Not your assistant, not your attorney contact, not your wife. Nobody. My wife has never known anything about Moretti business in 30 years. Good. Keep that record intact. She paid for the coffee. She drove home. Lorenzo called at 4 to say he was running an hour late. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man with nothing pressing on his conscience, easy and light, and he asked whether she needed anything picked up on his way home, and she said no, she was fine, take his time. She hung up and went to the guest room on the 3rd floor, the room she had mentally noted 8 months ago as the most private space in the house, farthest from Lorenzo's study, with a lock on the door that he had never asked about because he had never wanted to enter it. She sat on the edge of the guest bed with her laptop and began transferring the photographs from her phone into an encrypted folder she had created that afternoon, using an application she'd downloaded through a private browser session. This was something she had not thought about in the abstract before today, that she had these capabilities, these practical technical habits. She was not a woman who had been trained for this. She had a degree in business administration and a childhood spent in the margins of her father's complicated world, where she had absorbed, without being directly taught, that information was leverage and leverage was survival. Those lessons lived in her hands now. She was grateful for them. She worked for 2 hours. She organized everything chronologically, then by category: financial, personal, legal. She created 3 separate backups on 2 different external drives that she then put in a waterproof bag inside her gym duffel at the back of the guest room closet. She had 17% battery left on her laptop when she was done. She was plugging it in when she heard the front door. Lorenzo was home. She came downstairs in the way she had perfected over the past 24 hours. Unhurried, a little tired, one hand resting on the banister with the physical care of a woman in her 3rd trimester. Lorenzo was in the entryway hanging his coat, and he looked up when she came down and his face did the thing it always did, the softening, the smile. And she understood now what she had not understood before, which was that the smile was real. That was the part that was going to take a long time to process. He loved her, in whatever diminished and compartmentalized way a man like Lorenzo De Luca was capable of love. She believed he actually loved her. He had just chosen, with the cool strategic certainty of a man who had always placed empire over everything, to dispose of her anyway. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "The baby's been on my bladder all afternoon." He laughed. It was a real laugh, too. She watched him laugh and she thought about the word voluntary and kept her face soft. They ate dinner. They watched something on television, a documentary about national parks that neither of them particularly followed. At 10 o'clock, Lorenzo said he had calls in the morning and went upstairs, and Isabella sat on the couch for another 40 minutes with the television off, doing nothing, just breathing. The next 11 days were the most precise performance of her life. She kept the schedule of a woman who suspected nothing. She attended her prenatal appointment, bought things for the nursery, had lunch with Gia De Luca on a Thursday that Gia clearly found confusing. Gia had always expected Isabella to be more fractured, had been watching for cracks since the beginning, and the absence of cracks made her nervous in a way Isabella noted without acknowledging. "You seem good," Gia said over salads, with the tone of a woman who has phrased a question as a statement and is waiting to see if you catch it. "I feel good," Isabella said. The second trimester anxiety finally lifted. "I think I was just tired." Gia searched her face. "Marco says Lorenzo seems preoccupied lately." Business, Isabella said, and smiled. It's always business. The word arrived in Gia's expression like a stone dropping into still water. A small impact, then concentric rings of something complicated. Gia knew something. Maybe not everything, maybe not the scope of it, but she knew the shape of it, had probably known for longer than Isabella wanted to consider, and had done what she had always done. Looked away, smoothed it over, kept her position at the table. Isabella did not hold it against her. Survival was survival. Tell Marco not to worry, Isabella said pleasantly, and speared a piece of cucumber. On the 9th day after Thanksgiving, Lorenzo came home from a business dinner and found Isabella in the kitchen at 11 p.m. eating leftover pasta straight from the container, and for one long unscripted moment they stood looking at each other with the ordinary familiarity of two people who have shared a bed for 6 years, and something moved across Lorenzo's face that she couldn't categorize. Tenderness, maybe, or the ghost of it. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I was hungry." She held out the fork. "There's more." He took the fork. He ate standing next to her at the kitchen counter and told her something about the dinner. Who was there, what was discussed, the details carefully chosen and almost certainly curated. She listened. She asked the right questions. She refilled his water glass. This was the worst part. Not the rage, not the grief. Those were clean. The worst part was the domesticity of it, the way the ordinary continued to assert itself, the way her body had spent 6 years learning his rhythms and continued to operate on that knowledge even now, pouring his water, asking about his dinner, existing in the same warm kitchen light as if everything was the same as it had ever been. She went to bed before him that night and lay in the dark and thought about her father with an intensity that surprised her. Not his business methods, not his advice, just his face. The way he used to look at her when she was a child and didn't know yet that the world was going to require things of her, like she was complete and enough exactly as she was. She hadn't thought about his face in a long time. She thought about it now and felt the loss of him land fresh, felt it the way you feel something when your defenses are otherwise engaged and there's no surplus left to hold back everything at once. She pressed her hand against her stomach, and her son moved, a slow, firm motion, and she held on to that. On the 11th day, Adrian called. "I'm done," he said. "All of it?" "Everything. And Isabella—" He paused, and she could hear him choosing his words with unusual care. "It's worse than we thought. The reserve accounts aren't just accessed. They've been partially liquidated. Someone has been moving assets offshore in tranches small enough to avoid scrutiny, but I traced the pattern. If you wait another 6 weeks, there may not be enough left in those accounts to contest." She stood at the guest room window looking at the November garden below. Bare branches, dead grass, the stone bird bath with its skin of old ice. "He's accelerating," she said. "Something changed his timeline. I don't know what." She thought about Celeste Romano's message on Thanksgiving night. "I can't wait to see you tonight." She thought about the word almost in Lorenzo's message. It's almost time. Something had shifted in the weeks before Thanksgiving. Something had moved the plan forward. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel its shape. A pressure that had been building, a hand behind events pushing them faster. "Send me everything," she said. "Encrypted. You know the address." "It's already sent." "Adrian." She turned away from the window. "Thank you." "Your father would have done the same," he said, and hung up. She sat with her phone in her hands for a moment. Then she made 3 more calls. To a family law attorney whose name she'd found through a research session on a private browser 8 days ago, to a forensic accountant Adrian had used before and vetted, and to her sister Elena, who lived in Boston and was the only person in Isabella's personal life she was certain Lorenzo had never thought to monitor, because he had always considered Elena slightly frivolous, and therefore not worth his strategic attention. "I need you to hold something for me," Isabella told her sister. Elena didn't ask what. Elena had grown up in the same house Isabella had, understood the same lessons. "When?" she asked. "I'll drive it up this weekend. Tell Marcus you need the guest room." "It's already yours," Elena said. Saturday morning, Lorenzo mentioned he had a client in from overseas and would be at the club until evening. He said it easily, no change in his posture, no careful arrangement of his face. The line had become so deeply practiced that it no longer required his attention. It happened automatically, the way breathing happened. Isabella kissed him on the cheek and told him to have a good day. She drove to Boston. She handed Elena a sealed box containing one external hard drive with copies of everything: financial records, forged documents, photographs from Lorenzo's phone, Adrian's full analysis, and the 4 voice recordings. She hugged her sister in the cold driveway, and Elena held on to her a beat longer than usual. "Are you okay?" Elena asked against her hair. "I will be," Isabella said. It was the truest thing she'd said to anyone in 2 weeks. She drove home. Lorenzo was back by 7, cheerful and smelling of expensive scotch, and they had a quiet evening, and she let him fall asleep with his hand on her stomach because her son kicked while his hand was there, and Lorenzo laughed, surprised and delighted, and that moment cost her something she was not going to name. On Monday, she met with the family law attorney, a woman named Diane Lassiter, who had a corner office and the energy of someone who had heard everything twice and stopped being shocked by it on her 40th birthday. Isabella laid out the situation in 40 minutes without crying, which Diane seemed to find notable. The forged signatures alone, Diane said, reviewing the documents Adrian had authenticated, are criminal fraud combined with the financial irregularities and the asset movement. She set the papers down. "Mrs. DeLuca, your husband has significant exposure here." "I know," Isabella said, "but I don't want to move on the legal side yet, not until I understand the full extent of what's been moved and where it is. The longer you wait, I understand the risk." She met Diane's eyes. "He cannot know I'm building this. If he knows, I lose the advantage, and I lose—" She stopped. She chose the next word carefully. "I lose options." Diane looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has sat across from many frightened people and has learned to distinguish fear from clarity. What she saw in Isabella was the latter. "All right," Diane said, "but I want weekly check-ins. And Isabella—" She waited until she was sure she had her full attention. "If at any point you feel physically unsafe, you call me before anyone else. Not the police, not a family member. Me. We have a protocol." Isabella thought about the voice on the recording. "She's too trusting. It's going to make this clean." "I'll remember that," she said. She drove home through early December traffic, the city putting up its lights, and she thought about timing. She thought about what almost time had meant in Lorenzo's messages, and what had changed his pace, and whether she was moving fast enough, or whether fast enough was even a concept that applied here, whether there was a version of this where she had a choice about the timing at all, or whether the timing had already been chosen and she was just running against it. 3 days later, she found out what had changed Lorenzo's timeline. She found out because Marco DeLuca showed up at the house at 10 in the morning when Lorenzo was gone. And Marco had never once in 6 years shown up at the house without Lorenzo being there. And he stood in the entryway with his coat still on and his eyes carrying something she recognized as guilt. And she knew before he opened his mouth that whatever he was about to say, it was the thing that had been left out of everything she'd read and heard and uncovered. "I have to tell you something," Marco said. She led him to the living room. She did not offer him coffee. He sat on the edge of the couch with his elbows on his knees, and she sat across from him in the armchair that had been her father's, an old velvet piece she'd brought from the Moretti house that Lorenzo had always faintly disliked, and she waited. "There's going to be a meeting," Marco said, "in January. The board, the legitimate board, the DeLuca Family Holdings Board. Lorenzo's been preparing a presentation, a restructuring proposal." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Isabella, he's going to present it as a mutual decision, a reorganization of the Moretti DeLuca asset structure that you've both agreed to." He finally looked up at her. "He asked me to sign off on certain preliminary documents last month. I didn't understand then what I was signing. I told myself it was standard." His voice went thin. "I know that's not good enough." Isabella looked at her brother-in-law. She thought about Gia at lunch, her careful face, the way she'd said, "Marco says Lorenzo seems preoccupied." She thought about all the people in this orbit who had seen pieces of this and arranged those pieces into ignorance because the alternative was a confrontation they weren't prepared for. "What do the documents say?" she asked. "They amend your standing in the Moretti Trust. They remove your direct authority over the primary assets and transfer it to a management structure that Lorenzo controls." Marco's jaw worked. "They're dated 3 months ago. Your signature is on them." "My signature," Isabella said. He heard it in her voice. She watched the color leave his face as he understood what he was hearing. "She didn't sign them," he said very quietly, to himself almost. No, Isabella said. She didn't. The room was very quiet. Marco stood up abruptly. He turned away from her and walked to the window and stood there with one hand gripping the curtain and his shoulders in the posture of a man processing something that is rewriting too many things at once. She watched him and gave him the time he needed because the outcome of the next 60 seconds depended partly on which way Marco DeLuca fell. When he turned back around, his face had resolved into something she recognized. Her father's word for it had been reckoning, the look of a man who has been comfortable with a lie and has just run out of road. What do you need? He said. She looked at him for a long moment. Nothing yet, she said. But Marco. She held his gaze. When I need something, you will know. And when that time comes, you don't hesitate. You don't call Lorenzo first. You don't give him a warning. You don't decide at the last minute that he's your brother and loyalty means protecting him from consequences he chose. She paused. Can you do that? Marco DeLuca was 40 years old and had spent his entire adult life in his brother's shadow, making accommodations, smoothing things over, filing things under. That's just how Lorenzo is. She watched all of that pass across his face in about 4 seconds. Yes, he said. She nodded. After he left, she went to the guest room and sat on the floor with her back against the bed, and both hands on her stomach, and breathed. Her son moved. She breathed some more. January, Lorenzo had said. The board meeting was in January. That was 5 weeks. She pulled out her phone and called Adrian. He has a board presentation in January, she said when he picked up. He's going to present the asset restructuring as a joint decision. He has documents with my forged signature to support it. A silence. Then, how did you find this out? Marco. Another silence. She could hear Adrian recalibrating. Marco told you. Yes. Then Lorenzo doesn't know you know about the board meeting. Not yet. Isabella. Adrian's voice was very steady, very precise. If you're going to move, it needs to be before January, before that presentation. Once those documents enter a formal board proceeding, even with evidence of forgery, the legal process becomes significantly longer and more complicated and… He stopped. And, she said, and you will be significantly more vulnerable during that process than you are right now. She closed her eyes. Her son pressed against her ribs and she pressed back, a conversation they'd been having for weeks, a language of pressure and response. She opened her eyes. Then we move before January, she said. How much time do you need? She thought about the drives in Elena's guest room. She thought about Diane Lassiter's protocol. She thought about Marco's face when he said, "What do you need?" She thought about her husband's voice on a recording. She's too trusting. It's going to make this clean. 10 days, she said. And Lorenzo? Lorenzo, she said, is going to come home one night and find that I'm already gone. The 10 days began on a Wednesday. Isabella made a list, not on her phone, not on the laptop, on paper, in a small notebook she bought with cash from a drugstore 3 blocks from the prenatal clinic during her Tuesday appointment, tucked inside a pregnancy magazine she carried out of the store like a prop. The list was not sentimental, it was operational. She wrote it in the bathroom with the door locked and the fan running, the way her father had taught her to think. Not about what you want, but about what you need, and not about what you feel, but about what you can use. What she needed was time, documentation, and distance. In that order, in that sequence, with no variation. She gave herself 4 days to collect the last of what she needed from the house. Day 1. She went through the study while Lorenzo was at the club, photographed every document she hadn't already captured, and found, in a manila envelope taped to the underside of the center drawer of his desk, a location so obvious in its old movie hideousness that she almost respected the audacity of it. A handwritten note with 6 account numbers she didn't recognize and a name she did. Vincent Caro. She stared at that name for a long time, standing in Lorenzo's study with the envelope in her hand. Vincent Caro was a name her father had used exactly once in her hearing when she was 19 years old and had asked him why he'd ended a particular partnership. Her father had set down his coffee cup and said, "Because Vincent Caro is the kind of man who collects debts the way other men collect art. And when you can't pay, he takes something you love instead." He had not elaborated. She had not asked him to. The way he said it was enough. She photographed the note. She replaced it exactly as she'd found it. Day 2, she went through the safe in the master bedroom closet. She'd known the combination for 4 years, had memorized it by accident the first time Lorenzo opened it in front of her without thinking, which told her something about how thoroughly he'd stopped considering her a variable. Inside, she found the expected: cash in 3 currencies, 2 passports with Lorenzo's photograph and different names, a small pistol she didn't touch, and a USB drive she almost missed because it was sitting flat beneath the cash, black against black felt lining. She took the USB drive. She replaced the cash so the pistol's position wouldn't shift. She took the drive to Adrian that afternoon. He plugged it into an air-gapped laptop he'd bought specifically for this purpose. She'd asked him to when they met at the bakery, and he'd understood without her explaining why a clean machine mattered. They sat in his home office while it loaded, a room that smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper and felt the way her father's study had felt, and Adrian scrolled through the contents with the expressionless focus of a man reading a damage report, and Isabella watched his face. His face told her everything before his voice did. "These are communications," he said, "between Lorenzo and someone with the initials VC. He paused. "Over 18 months. "Vincent Caro," she said. Adrian looked at her, then back at the screen. "They go back further than your marriage." She had not expected that. She felt it move through her. A specific kind of cold, the kind that doesn't come from temperature but from revision, from the sudden understanding that the timeline you've been operating with is wrong and needs to be rebuilt from scratch. "How much further?" she said. "The earliest communication is dated 9 years ago." Adrian's voice was very controlled. "Isabella, this was before your father's illness, well before." She made herself sit still. "What are they discussing?" she said. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of reluctance. He was not a reluctant man, but the quiet of a person locating the precise words for a precise thing. "The Moretti holdings," he said. "Your father's reserve accounts specifically. The ones I told you were partially liquidated." He scrolled. "According to these communications, the plan to access those accounts predates your marriage to Lorenzo by approximately 2 years. Lorenzo was already in contact with Caro before he met you." He stopped scrolling. "Isabella, the introduction. Lorenzo meeting you at the charity gala. Caro references it in a message from 9 years ago. He says..." Adrian stopped. "Read it," she said. Adrian read it. He read it in the flat, measured voice of a man reading a legal document, draining it of inflection to keep it clean. "The Moretti daughter will be your access point. She trusts easily and she's loyal to the family name. Get her to marry you and the reserve accounts become accessible through legitimate inheritance structures. The old man won't live forever, and his daughter won't know what to do with the empire without a husband to guide her." The room was very quiet. Isabella's hands were in her lap. She became aware of them because they were completely motionless, not the still of composure, but the still of a body that has stopped sending instructions to its extremities because all available resources have been redirected somewhere else. "The charity gala," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was slightly surprised. "He was sent to the charity gala." "It appears so." "Our meeting was arranged," Adrian said. He said it quietly, without softness, the way a doctor says a diagnosis. Not cruelly, but without the mercy of imprecision. Arranged. 6 years of a marriage that had started as a strategy. The courtship she had believed was spontaneous and charged and real. The meetings that seemed accidental, the patience he showed her, the slow, careful way he had earned her trust over 18 months before proposing, all of it navigated, all of it planned by a man she'd never met, with 6 account numbers written in her husband's handwriting. She stood up. She walked to the window of Adrian's home office and looked at the street outside. Ordinary December afternoon, a woman walking a dog, a UPS truck double parked, a kid on a bicycle who was going too fast for the weather. All of it completely indifferent, the world not pausing for a single second to acknowledge that the entire architecture of her adult life had just been revealed as a construction. She stood at the window for maybe 2 minutes. Then she turned around. "Does this change the timeline?" she said. Adrian blinked. She could see him recalibrating, had expected her to need more time than 2 minutes before she could speak functionally. He didn't know yet, couldn't know, that the grief of this was going to live somewhere separate from the operational part of her, that she had divided herself in some essential way on Thanksgiving night, and that the part of her that made decisions was going to continue making decisions regardless of what the other part was enduring. It complicates it, he said carefully. If Cairo is involved, this is not a domestic dispute or a straightforward fraud case. Cairo has connections in the financial sector and outside of it. If he believes his arrangement with Lorenzo is at risk, he'll act, she said. Yes. And if Lorenzo tells him I'm building a case, he will not wait for a board meeting, Adrian said. She came back to the chair. She sat down. She picked up the notebook that was in her bag and clicked open a pen and said, "Tell me everything on that drive that I need to know. Don't paraphrase. Don't protect me from it. Everything." Adrian told her everything. It took 2 hours. When he was done, the notebook had 12 pages of notes, and Isabella's pen hand ached, and the December light outside had gone from gray to dark. And she sat for a moment in the lamplight of Adrian's office, feeling the full weight of what she now knew, which was that she had been, since before she was married, a target, a variable in another man's financial strategy. The love story she had lived inside for 6 years had been, at its origin, a business decision made by a man named Vincent Caro over a dinner she hadn't attended. She thought about the baby, her son, who had no knowledge of any of this, who existed in the warmth and movement of her body, completely unaware that he had been planned for in those messages too, referenced in one exchange as the natural heir component that will complicate any legal challenge from the wife once she's removed. Her son was a component, a complication, a legal consideration. She put her hand on her stomach and kept her face very still. "I need to move faster," she said. "Isabella, not 10 days. I need to be out of that house in 5. The documentation isn't—" "Adrian." She looked at him. "If Caro decides I'm a threat before I'm ready, I lose everything. My son loses everything. 5 days. What can we have ready in 5 days?" Adrian looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man calculating not just logistics but risk tolerances, the specific weight of a 6 months pregnant woman against the specific weight of a man like Vincent Caro. "Enough," he said finally. "Not everything, but enough." "Enough is what we work with," she said. She drove home in the dark and made dinner and sat across from Lorenzo and watched him eat the food she had cooked and felt the strange airless quality of the deception fully reversed now. She was the one performing. She was the one with the hidden architecture, and it should have felt like power, but it mostly felt like exhaustion. "You're quiet," Lorenzo said. "Tired," she said. "3rd trimester tired." He nodded. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture so practiced it no longer required his attention, and she turned her hand over and let him hold it and looked at his face, the face of a man she had loved, a man whose presence in her life had been engineered by someone else, a man who was also, whatever his origins in her story, the father of her child. And she wondered whether any of what he felt for her had been real, or whether real was even a meaningful category for a man who had started their relationship as a job. She decided she didn't want to know. Knowing wouldn't help anything. On day 3, she made a mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind of mistake that is invisible at the time and only reveals itself later, when you are standing in its consequences trying to trace back the moment. She called Elena from the house phone. Not her cell, not a burner, the house phone in the kitchen, because her cell was on 3% and charging in the bedroom, and she needed to tell Elena that the timeline had changed, that she'd need the guest room sooner than expected. The call lasted 4 minutes. She said nothing incriminating in plain language. She and Elena had enough shared history and enough instinct for oblique communication that the whole conversation sounded like 2 sisters coordinating Christmas plans. But she had called from the house phone. She didn't think about it again until day 4. Day 4 was a Friday. Lorenzo came home for lunch, which he never did. He had not come home for lunch in the 6 years of their marriage, had always treated midday as prime working hours. Immovable. And the fact of him walking through the door at 12:30 with his coat still on and his eyes doing something Isabella had not seen them do before made her stomach drop before she had conscious language for why. His eyes were assessing. Not the familiar warm performance of a husband coming home. Something underneath that. Something that had bypassed the performance entirely. He was looking at the kitchen. He was looking at her. He was looking at the kitchen again. "You didn't tell me you were coming home," she said. She was at the counter making tea. She kept making the tea. Her hands kept moving. "Spontaneous," he said. He set his keys on the counter. He didn't hang his coat. You hungry? I can have something sent. I was just going to have soup. He nodded. He moved to the refrigerator and opened it and stood looking inside it for longer than necessary. A man who was not actually looking at food. You called Elena yesterday, he said. To the refrigerator. Isabella poured the hot water into her cup. She watched the tea bloom dark in the water. I called her Tuesday, actually, she said, to talk about Christmas. Right. He closed the refrigerator. He hadn't taken anything out. She okay? She's fine. Marcus is traveling. She's lonely. She picked up her cup. Why? He looked at her. The assessment again, there and then papered over, covered fast, the performance back in place. I was thinking we should have them down for the holidays. Elena and Marcus. Make a real thing of it. He smiled. You've been lonely too. I know I've been distracted. That would be nice, she said. He stayed for 40 minutes. He ate nothing, which she noted. When he left, he kissed her on the mouth instead of the forehead, which he also did not usually do for midday goodbyes. And she stood at the kitchen window and watched his car back down the drive and sat with the particular frequency of that visit. The unannounced arrival, the refrigerator, the house phone question, wrapped in a casual mention of Elena, and felt the careful structure of her plan develop its first crack. He knew something, not everything. But the visit was a probe, a temperature check, a man who had been alerted to something and was trying to establish without revealing that he'd been alerted. The house phone. Someone had flagged the call, which meant the house phone was monitored, which meant she had been living in a monitored house and hadn't known it, and now the question was not whether she had triggered something, but how much she had triggered, and how long she had before it became an action rather than a suspicion. She called Adrian from a payphone 2 blocks from a coffee shop she drove to immediately after Lorenzo left. She stood outside in the December cold with the receiver against her ear and told him what had happened in a voice she kept low and even. Adrian's answer was immediate. You leave tonight. I'm not ready. Isabella, if he's monitoring the phones and he ran that call to Elena, what does he actually know? That I called my sister about Christmas. He knows you called from the house instead of your cell. He knows the timing. If his people are thorough. Are they thorough? A pause. Vincent Caro's people are thorough. She gripped the payphone receiver. A woman walked past with a stroller, head down against the wind, completely in her own world. Isabella watched her go. Tomorrow morning, Isabella said. Lorenzo has a breakfast meeting at 7:30. He won't be home before 10. That gives me 3 hours. That's not much time. It's what I have. Have the car ready. And Adrian, she paused. Don't use your regular car, something he won't recognize. She drove home. She made soup. She sat on the couch with a book she didn't read. And when Lorenzo came home at 7, she was exactly where she would have been on any ordinary evening, and they watched television, and she laughed at 2 things and fell asleep on the couch around 9, which she had done genuinely once before, and which seemed to satisfy something in him, because when she woke and went upstairs, he was already in bed, and the quality of his sleep. She checked. She stood in the dark bedroom doorway and listened to his breathing for 30 seconds. Was real, was the thick, unguarded sleep of a man who has been reassured. She slept 4 hours. She didn't need an alarm. At 5 a.m., she got up. She went to the bathroom. She stood in the shower for 8 minutes. Not because she needed to, but because it was the most private room in the house, and she needed 8 minutes to run through the sequence of what was about to happen with the focused attention of someone who understands that the difference between a plan and an outcome is execution, and execution requires no wasted motion. Then she dried off, dressed quietly in the dark bathroom, and went to the guest room. She had, over the previous 3 days, moved what she needed in increments, small enough that nothing looked like packing, the way you move things in a shared space without announcing movement. A few items of clothing folded into the gym bag, the backup drives, the notebook, her father's watch, which she wore every day, and which Lorenzo had always slightly resented, which told her something about the limits of what he'd been willing to accept even in a marriage he'd manufactured. She took the bag to the back hallway by the kitchen door. She put on her coat. She put her shoes on while sitting on the back step, lacing them in the dark, listening to the house. Lorenzo's breathing she could not hear from here. But the house had its own breath, the heat cycling, the refrigerator's compressor, The old radiator in the corner of the back hallway that clicked twice per hour. She had been listening to those sounds for 6 years. She listened to them now one more time with the attention of someone memorizing rather than inhabiting. She picked up the bag. She had her hand on the back door handle when her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She looked at the screen. A text from a number she didn't recognize. No name. Sent at 5:14 a.m. Don't use Viscari. He's been compromised. Don't go to Elena. Don't go anywhere Viscari knows about. If you leave this morning, they will be waiting. She stood perfectly still with her hand on the door handle and read the message 3 times. Then she stepped back from the door. She sat down on the back step, the inside step, not the outside one, and read it again and tried to think clearly through the specific blankness that happens when the ground shifts under a plan you have spent 2 weeks building with everything you had. Compromised. The word had a specific meaning in the context she was living in. It did not mean careless or mistaken. It meant turned. It meant that someone had gotten to Adrian Viscari, a man she had trusted with every piece of what she was building, every document, every move, every name, and that someone was not a stranger, that someone had the resources and the connections and the prior knowledge to identify Adrian as her access point and then find a lever to use on him. Vincent Caro had been in this business for 40 years. He would have found a lever inside a week. She sat on the back step with the gym bag between her feet and worked through the arithmetic of what compromised meant for the past 2 weeks. Everything she'd told Adrian, he potentially knew. The drive contents, he'd seen them, he'd read them with her, and then she'd left the drive with him for copying. Elena's address he'd heard her mention in their first meeting. Diane Lassiter. She'd called Diane from her cell phone, which was not compromised as far as she knew, but she had mentioned Diane's name to Adrian, which meant if Caro had Adrian, he had Diane's name, and someone with Caro's resources could have had Diane's office under surveillance within 24 hours of receiving that name. Her hands were shaking now. She pressed them flat against her thighs the way she had on Thanksgiving morning and breathed through it. The car Adrian was supposed to send. A car she didn't know, a driver she hadn't vetted personally, an unknown vehicle she was supposed to get into in the dark at 5 in the morning while 6 months pregnant. She thought about that car, idling somewhere nearby, waiting for her to come out the back door. She did not go out the back door. She sat on the interior back step for 6 minutes and thought about who could have sent the warning text and why they would warn her and whether it was itself a manipulation, a second move in a game she didn't have the board for yet. She thought about Marco. She thought about Gia. She thought about every person who existed in the perimeter of her situation who might know enough to send those specific words. Then she thought about something Lorenzo had said once, early in the marriage, when she had asked him how he handled people he couldn't trust. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, and she had thought at the time it was just his way of being interesting, the cultivated enigma he carried like a style choice. The most useful people are usually the ones who have every reason to want you to fail, but one reason to want you to survive. She stared at the text. One reason to want her to survive. She opened her contacts. She scrolled to a name she had never called, a number given to her at a family gathering 4 years ago by a woman who had said, with a specificity that hadn't made sense to Isabella at the time, "If you ever need anything and the normal channels feel wrong, you call me directly." Not Lorenzo, not Adrian, me. Renata Caro, Lorenzo's aunt, a woman in her late 60s who had spent 40 years watching men like Lorenzo and Caro build their worlds, and who had given Isabella her personal number with the precision of someone making a deposit they expected to collect one day. Isabella stared at the name. In the master bedroom above her, Lorenzo De Luca slept in the thick unconscious certainty of a man whose plan was on schedule. She pressed call. Renata answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant she had been waiting, which meant the text had come from a phone near enough to Renata that the two facts connected in Isabella's chest into something that felt like being caught by a current, not drowning, but moving, fast, and without full control, in a direction she hadn't chosen, but that was carrying her forward anyway. "I know about the car," Isabella said, without greeting. "Then you understand," Renata said, "that you can't use what you've been building, not the way you planned it." "How much does he have?" "Enough that if you walk out of that house this morning, the way you were going to walk out, you get in a car and you don't get where you were going." A pause. Not for effect. Renata was not a woman who used pauses for effect, for precision. And the baby? Don't, Isabella said. Silence. Tell me what I have left, Isabella said. Renata's voice was steady and old and entirely without performance. You have yourself. You have what's in your head. And you have one person he hasn't touched yet because he doesn't know she exists. Another pause. A woman named Lena Park, financial crimes attorney. She doesn't work through referrals, and she's not in any network Caro monitors. I'm going to text you her number in 30 seconds. You call her from a phone Lorenzo has never touched. And then Renata's voice shifted, just slightly, to something more direct than everything before it. You go back upstairs, and you get into bed, and you do not leave that house today. Isabella's jaw tightened. If I stay? If you run without a plan, you lose everything. If you stay one more day and make one phone call, you have a chance. Renata paused. One day, Isabella. Can you do one more day? Above her, the house was silent. The radiator clicked. Lorenzo slept. She looked at the back door. She looked at the gym bag between her feet. She looked at her own hands in the dark hallway of a house that had been a trap since before she walked into it, that had been designed around her, built to fit the shape of her trust, like a mold made from a cast of something living. Yes, she said. She went back upstairs. She put the gym bag in the guest room closet. She took off her shoes, her coat. She got back into bed beside Lorenzo and lay on her side and stared at the wall. Her son moved against her ribs. Slow, firm, insistent, the way he always moved at this hour, as if he was already impatient with stillness, already arguing against it. She pressed her hand against the movement and held it there. She was out of plans. She was out of allies she could verify. She was in a monitored house with a man who had married her as a contract and was sleeping 3 feet away from her without knowing that she knew. And the person who had just saved her from walking into whatever was waiting outside was Lorenzo's own aunt, which meant that the web of who knew what and who owed whom and who had reason to want which outcome was so much more tangled than anything she had built her 2-week plan around. She was going to have to do this differently than she had thought. She was going to have to do this in a way that required something she hadn't needed yet. Not patience, not documentation, not the careful assembly of evidence. Something harder than all of those things. She was going to have to trust a stranger with everything, on one phone call, with no safety net, while the man who had arranged her life around his own ambition slept beside her, and the December light began to come gray and thin through the curtains. And she was going to have to do it without showing on her face, not for a single moment, not over breakfast, not over whatever ordinary morning Lorenzo De Luca was going to perform for her benefit in a few hours. That she had spent the night discovering that every exit she had built had already been mapped, and that she was going to have to find a door that no one had thought to watch, because no one had thought she was capable of finding it. She did not sleep again. She lay beside Lorenzo until 6:45, when his alarm went off, and he silenced it with the automatic efficiency of a man whose body had long since stopped needing the extra minutes. She heard him shower. She heard the particular sound of his dress shoes on the hardwood in the closet. She kept her breathing slow and her eyes partially closed, and when he came to the bed to check on her, she could feel him standing there, his presence a specific weight in the room. She made the small, unconscious shift of a person deep in genuine sleep. He left without waking her. She counted to 60 after she heard the front door. Then she got up. The phone Renata had texted the number to was a prepaid she had bought 6 days ago and kept in the gym bag. It was one of the things she had thought to do when she still had a plan, and it was one of the few things that plan had produced that remained intact. She took it to the bathroom, sat on the tile floor with her back against the cold side of the tub, and called Lena Park. Lena Park answered like someone who had been up for hours. No greeting, just, "Who gave you this number?" "Renata Caro." A short silence. Not suspicious. Evaluating. "When?" "She texted me her contact at 4:50 this morning. I'm calling you from a clean phone." "Where are you right now?" "My house. My husband's gone until 10. "And you're certain the house is monitored?" "I'm certain the landline is. I believe there may be other surveillance. I don't know its scope." "Okay." Lena Park's voice was the voice of someone running simultaneous calculations and finding them manageable. "Talk to me. Everything. You have until I tell you to stop." Isabella talked for 22 minutes without stopping. She told Lana everything she had told Adrian and everything she had found after Adrian, and then she told her about the USB drive and Vincent Caro and the messages from 9 years ago and the forged signatures and the board meeting in January. She told her about Adrian's compromise and the car that had been waiting and Marco and the voice on the recording. She told her all of it in the same flat operational register she had been using for 2 weeks, the one she'd developed to keep the grief and the fury in their separate compartments so the working part of her could function, and Lena Park listened without interrupting until Isabella stopped. Then Lena said, "Where are the backup drives?" "One with my sister in Boston, one in a bag in my guest room closet." "The one in your house, remove it today. Don't leave the house to do it. Take it apart. Drives can be located if someone has the right equipment and enough proximity." A beat. "Do you have anything physical Lorenzo hasn't touched? A car he doesn't know about? A card in a name he's never seen?" "I have a credit card in my maid. I stopped using it after the wedding, but I kept it current," she thought. "And there's a car. It was my father's. It's in a storage facility in the East Bay. Lorenzo knows it exists, but I don't think he knows the facility." "Think or know?" "No," Isabella said after a moment. "I paid the last 2 renewals in cash. I never mentioned the location." "Good." Lena's voice shifted into something more directive. "Here's what the next 36 hours look like. Today you do nothing that deviates from your normal pattern. Nothing. You eat what you normally eat, you go where you normally go, you call whoever you normally call. Tonight I need you to write down, from memory, not from any document, every account number, every company name, every figure you remember from what you found. Everything you can reconstruct without touching a document." Another beat. "How is your memory?" "Good," Isabella said. "My father used to make me memorize things. He said paper was a liability." The first pause that sounded like something other than calculation. "Smart man," Lena said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., regardless of where Lorenzo is or isn't, you leave the house. You drive to the storage facility in the East Bay, you pick up the car, and you drive it to this address." She read out an address in Marin. "Don't use GPS. Don't use your phone after you leave the house. Write the address on your hand if you need to. Wash it off before you go to bed tonight." Her voice went flat and direct. "Can you drive in your condition?" "I'm pregnant, not injured." "Good. Questions?" Isabella thought. Her mind ran the sequence of what Lena had outlined, stress testing each step, looking for the point where it required something she couldn't control. She found one. "Lorenzo may not leave the house before 8 tomorrow," she said. "If he stayed home on Friday—" "If he's home at 8, you leave anyway," Lena said. "You tell him you have a prenatal appointment. Do you have one coming up?" "I have one the 22nd. Move it. Call today and move it to tomorrow. If he checks, it'll be in the system." Another pause. "Isabella, if he tries to stop you leaving the house, you get out anyway. You don't argue, you don't explain, you walk to the car and you drive away. Whatever happens after that is my problem to manage. Understood?" The word "stop" sat in Isabella's chest for a moment with a specific gravity. She thought about Lorenzo standing in the kitchen looking at the refrigerator. She thought about the face he showed her that didn't quite match the face underneath. She thought about the gun in the safe. "Understood," she said. "One more thing." Lena's voice dropped, not in volume, but in register. Lower, more personal. The first time in the conversation, it had carried the weight of a human being rather than a professional. "You're how far along?" 28 weeks. "You're doing this right," Lena said. "I need you to believe that. Not because it's easy or because I can guarantee you the outcome. I can't. But the decision you made this morning not to get in that car, that was the right call. Every good decision from here is one more brick. You understand?" Isabella understood. She didn't say so. She hung up, sat on the bathroom floor for another 30 seconds, and then stood up and went to make breakfast. She moved through Saturday with the stillness of an actor who knows the scene requires her to be unremarkable. She called the prenatal clinic and moved her appointment. She dismantled the backup drive from the guest room closet, removed the actual disc from its casing, and hid the disc flat inside the lining of a maternity coat she no longer wore, hung at the back of the closet behind winter things. She cooked. She watched television. She did the crossword from Thursday's paper that she hadn't gotten to, filling in the boxes with the disciplined focus of someone who needs their hands to be doing something their brain can monitor. Lorenzo came home at noon with flowers. Yellow ones, her favorite, which he had to actively remember because his instinct was always red. And the fact that he'd remembered told her his antenna was up, that he was performing attentiveness because he needed her settled. For no reason, he said. They're beautiful, she said. She put them in water. She kissed him on the cheek. They had lunch together. He was warm and present and asked about the baby, about names they hadn't settled on, about whether she wanted to paint the nursery herself or let the decorator handle it. And she answered every question with the comfortable ease of a woman who did not know that the man across the table had been sent to marry her 9 years ago by a man with 6 account numbers written in the margin of a handwritten note. At 3, he took a call and went to his study. She memorized account numbers at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her, the figures living now only in the space behind her eyes, where nobody could access them. At dinner, he opened a good bottle of wine and didn't comment when she didn't drink. He had never pushed her about alcohol during the pregnancy, which was something, she supposed, which was the kind of thing you still noticed even when everything else had collapsed. They went to bed at 10. She lay awake until 2. At some point between 2 and 3, she must have slept because she came back to consciousness with a start at 5:18, and her heart going fast and her hand already on her stomach before she was fully oriented. 7:53. That was when Lorenzo said he had calls starting at 8, and she said she had her prenatal appointment and needed to leave by 7:45. He was already dressed when she said it, standing in the closet doorway with his phone in his hand, and something moved across his face that lasted less than a second, a micro-adjustment, a recalculation. And then he said, "Drive safe. Call me when you're done." "I will," she said. She took the gym bag to the car. She had repacked it the night before. The maternity coat with the drive in the lining, the notebook, her father's watch, 3 changes of clothes, her passport, the prepaid phone, and the Moretti family file, documents she had copied by hand from memory the previous night, financial figures reconstructed from the hours she had spent reading them in Adrian's office, company names and account numbers written in her own handwriting, which would mean nothing to anyone who found them without the context to decode them, but which meant everything to her and would mean everything to Lena Park. She backed out of the driveway at 7:41. She did not look in the rearview mirror as she drove away. She had decided she wasn't going to. Looking back at the house would cost her something she needed to keep. The storage facility in the East Bay was 40 minutes without traffic. She drove in the careful, unhurried way of someone who cannot afford to be stopped for anything, and she got there at 8:27 in her father's car, a dark blue sedan, 12 years old, mechanically maintained because she had paid for its maintenance faithfully since his death. The one thing of his she hadn't been able to give up. Started on the second try. She transferred the gym bag. She left her primary car in the storage unit and locked it. She drove to Maran without GPS, the address written in eyeliner on the inside of her left wrist, low enough that her sleeve covered it. The address was a law office above a dry cleaner on a side street, the kind of location specifically chosen to be unremarkable. She was buzzed in before she knocked, which meant someone had been watching for her arrival. Lena Park was not what Isabella had built in her mind. She had constructed someone severe and steel-haired from the voice on the phone. The actual Lena Park was 40, Korean-American, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a cardigan that had a small coffee stain on the left cuff. And she shook Isabella's hand with the straightforward grip of someone who had never considered whether her handshake made an impression. "Sit down," Lena said. "You want water? You should be drinking water." "I'm fine." "Sit anyway. You've been driving." She pulled a chair out from the conference table and waited until Isabella sat before she sat across from her. "I've been working since your call yesterday. Tell me what you remember." They worked for 3 hours. Lena had 2 associates in the adjacent room who fed documents and cross-referenced figures as Isabella reconstructed them from memory, and the rhythm of it, her speaking, their verification, Lena's pointed follow-up questions, had the quality of something being built in real time, a structure going up fast because the weather was coming and there was no more time to be careful about the finish work. At the 2-hour mark, Lena said, "The Caro connection is what makes this criminal rather than civil. If we can establish the conspiracy to defraud, the original plan from 9 years ago, the forged documents, the financial rerouting, this isn't a divorce proceeding. This is a federal case." "How long does a federal case take?" Isabella said. "To file initial charges? With what you've given me and what I can corroborate through the financial records, 2 weeks, maybe less. Lena looked at her directly. But Isabella, the moment we file, Lorenzo will know. Caro will know. The window between filing and protective custody for you is, how small? Hours, maybe less. She held Isabella's gaze. You cannot be in a place either of them know about when we file. I won't be. You have somewhere? I'll have somewhere. She thought about Renata. She thought about the specific quality of Renata's voice at 4:50 in the morning. Awake, precise, prepared. A woman who had chosen which side she was on long before the moment required the choice. Give me 24 hours to arrange it. Lena nodded. One of the associates came in and set a printed document in front of her without a word, and Lena read it and then passed it to Isabella. Preliminary authentication on the signature forgeries. Our document examiner worked through the night. The second loop on the capital I is consistent across all forged documents and inconsistent with your genuine signature on file. Isabella looked at her own name on a document she had never signed. She looked at it for a moment and then set it face down on the table. File as soon as I tell you I'm clear, she said. Not before. No matter what. Understood. She called Renata from the prepaid on the drive back toward the city. The call lasted 6 minutes. Renata gave her an address in Napa, a property registered under a corporation that had no visible connection to the Caro family, acquired through a third party before Lorenzo and Isabella had married. A house Renata had maintained, she said, the way you maintain something you hope you'll never need. Has Lorenzo ever mentioned this property? Isabella asked. Lorenzo doesn't know it exists, Renata said, and Caro has never had reason to find it because it's never appeared in any proceeding or document connected to the family. Can you get me in today? The key is under the left planter on the back porch. It's a terracotta pot with a dead rosemary plant in it. I never could keep rosemary alive. For the first time in 2 weeks, something moved in Isabella's chest that was adjacent to almost human. Not relief, not yet, but the specific quality of unexpectedness that comes when a dead rosemary plant is mentioned and it makes you feel briefly, fractionally, less alone. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Renata said. Get there first. She was 40 minutes from Napa when her prepaid phone buzzed with a text from Lena Park. Lorenzo's counsel filed an emergency injunction this morning, claiming you're a flight risk with marital assets. Judge Rodriguez. Hearing Monday 10 a.m. They know you left. Isabella read the text at a red light. She read it twice. He knew she'd left. Not where she'd gone. He couldn't know that she'd used the old car and a clean phone and an address that didn't connect to anyone in her visible life. But he knew she wasn't at a prenatal appointment, and he knew the primary car was still in the storage facility because she ran it back. Because he had almost certainly had her car tracked and the GPS had stopped moving in the East Bay, and she had not considered that, had not thought past the prepaid phone and the clean address to the car itself, the car she'd owned for 6 years that he'd had 6 years to equip however he chose. Emergency injunction. Monday morning. That was 36 hours. She texted back one word. Proceed. Lena responded in under a minute. You sure? Once I move, there's no... Proceed, she typed again. She put the phone down on the passenger seat and drove. The house in Napa was set back from a county road behind a line of old oaks that had been there longer than any of the people currently using them for cover. She found the key under the dead rosemary, exactly where Renata said it would be. And inside the house was clean and stocked and completely without personality. The furniture of a house that has been maintained but not lived in, functional, and without the accumulated debris of habitation. She stood in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and felt the specific quality of a space where no one knew she was. She called Elena from the prepaid. I'm out, she said. Elena exhaled. It was the sound of someone who has been holding something for 2 weeks and is finally allowed to set it down. Are you safe? For now. She sat down at the kitchen table. Get the drive out of your guest room. Don't mail it, don't ship it. I need you to drive it to an address I'm going to give you. She read Elena the address of Lena Park's office. Today, before 5. I'm already in the car, Elena said. Elena, I've been packed for a week, Tell me the address again. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything. Her son was moving, the long, slow rolls he did in the afternoon, and she tracked his movement with her hand and breathed and let herself be, for a few minutes, not strategic about anything. Then she heard gravel moving in the driveway. She was on her feet before she knew she'd decided to stand, the chair scraping back, and she crossed to the kitchen window and looked out, and the car pulling up was not a car she recognized, a black SUV, plates she couldn't read from this angle. And she went cold in the specific way that means the body has shifted from thinking to surviving. And she looked at the room around her for exit options with the fast, flat calculation of someone who has no good options and needs to pick the least bad one. The car stopped. The driver's door opened. Marco DeLuca got out. She stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at him through the window, and her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she made herself stay still, made herself read the whole picture. Marco alone, no second car visible. His posture when he got out wrong for someone who had been sent to retrieve something, too uncertain, too exposed, not the posture of a man with backup. She opened the back door. "How did you find me?" she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. Marco stopped 10 feet from the back porch. He looked terrible, so the specific terrible of someone who hasn't slept and has been running on something that is starting to run out. "Renata called me," he said. "She said you were here. She wanted someone—" He stopped. "She wanted someone between you and the road, in case someone else figured it out." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. "Did Lorenzo send you?" "Lorenzo thinks I'm following up a lead on where you went." His jaw worked. He has 2 of his people watching the storage facility, and he has someone on Elena's building in Boston. Isabella's stomach dropped. "Elena left Boston an hour ago." Marco's face changed. "Does she have everything?" She thought fast. "She's driving to the city. She doesn't know she might be followed." She already had the prepaid in her hand. She called Elena and got 3 rings and no answer, and the cold moved up through her chest and she called again. Elena answered on the 4th ring, slightly breathless. "I just walked in. There were 2 men outside my building when I left. I didn't stop. I just kept walking to the parking garage." "Are you in your car?" "Yes." "Are you being followed right now?" A pause. The sound of traffic. "I don't... There's a black car 2 behind me that was also on Storo. I don't know." "Take the next exit," Isabella said. "Any exit. Go somewhere public. A mall, a hospital, somewhere with a lot of people and cameras. Don't stop anywhere isolated. Call me when you're parked." "Okay." Elena's voice was tight and controlled, the voice of a Moretti woman who had also grown up in the margin of a complicated world. "Okay, I've got it." She hung up. She looked at Marco. "If they follow her to the drive," Marco started. "I know. Lorenzo can't know what's on that drive before Monday. If Caro gets his hands on it before the filing, I said I know." She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and breathed. Her son moved, a sharp kick this time, emphatic, as if registering protest at the pace of events. "How many people does Lorenzo have on this?" "4 that I've seen. Caro has more. I don't know their number." "And where is Lorenzo right now?" "He was at the house when I left. Isabella, he's not calm. He's been calm for 6 years about everything. Right now he is not calm." Marco's voice dropped. "He knows the injunction won't hold if you have what I think you have. He's trying to move things before Monday." "What things?" Marco's mouth pressed flat. "The remaining reserve accounts. He had a call this morning I wasn't supposed to hear. He's trying to liquidate what's left and route it before the court can freeze assets." Isabella felt something happen in her chest. Not panic, something cleaner and colder than panic. The thing that happens when a situation that has been urgent becomes immediate in the specific sense that minutes matter now rather than days. "How long does a wire transfer take to clear offshore?" she said. "For the amounts he's moving? If he initiates today?" Marco calculated. "Monday morning, early." The hearing was Monday at 10. If the transfers cleared before 10 a.m., the assets would be beyond the reach of a domestic court order, regardless of what Lena filed. 6 years of her family's holdings, built by her father over a lifetime, moving into an account in a jurisdiction where no injunction from a San Francisco judge meant anything. She looked at Marco. "I need you to do something," she said, "and I need you to do it in the next 2 hours." He straightened slightly, the uncertain posture shifting into something else, something that looked a little like the relief of a man who has been waiting to be told what to do and is finally being told. "What?" The board, she said. The legitimate holdings board. They have an emergency convening provision, Article 12 of the DeLuca Family Charter. Any director can call an emergency session with 24 hours' notice if they have evidence of material financial fraud. She held his gaze. You are a director. Marco stared at her. If I call an emergency session before Lorenzo knows what I have, you don't need anything, she said. You call it and cite the article. The session happens Sunday night. Lorenzo can't stop it if it's properly convened, and he can't move the assets if the board has formally flagged them for review. She paused. Can you do that? Marco was very still. He's my brother, he said. I know. She didn't soften it, and she didn't apologize for not softening it. He was also going to take your signature on documents that made you complicit in federal fraud. He used you, Marco. He's been using everyone in his proximity for a very long time. She let that sit for 1 second and no more. Then you do it? Something in Marco DeLuca's face went through a process that was painful to watch. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. The specific quiet of a man giving up on the version of a person he wanted his brother to be. Yes, he said. Call your attorney first. Not the family attorney, your personal one. Tell them you need to invoke Article 12 and why. Get it on record that you're acting on counsel's advice before you make the call to the board, she thought. And Marco, after you make that call, you do not go home. You go somewhere Lorenzo doesn't know about and you stay there until Monday. He nodded. He got back in the car. She watched him drive back down the gravel toward the county road, and then she went inside and stood in the kitchen of Renata's unlived-in house and thought about Sunday night and what an emergency board session looked like when the man who had run that board for 6 years walked into a room that had been convened against him. Her phone buzzed. Elena. Parked. I think I lost them. Mall in Framingham. What do I do? Isabella typed. Stay there, I'm sending someone to you. She called Lena Park. She explained the situation in 45 seconds, and Lena, without blinking, said she had a contact in Boston who could escort Elena and the drive to a secure location before end of day. This is accelerating, Lena said. I know. The filing. I can do it tonight instead of Monday. If Lorenzo is moving assets, a Saturday emergency filing with a judge. I know who takes financial crime seriously could freeze everything by morning. Isabella closed her eyes, opened them. What's the risk? That it doesn't hold and tips him off that we're moving faster than he thought. A pause. But if he's already liquidating, he already knows the clock is running. The risk of waiting is higher than the risk of moving. Isabella stood in the kitchen with the late afternoon light coming through the window at a low December angle, and she thought about her father's watch on her wrist, and she thought about her son pressing against her ribs, and she thought about a charity gala 9 years ago and a man who had been sent there to find her. File it, she said. Lena hung up without ceremony. Isabella set the phone down on the counter. She filled a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink the way she had on Thanksgiving night, looking at her own reflection in the window glass, and this time the woman looking back at her was someone she recognized and someone she didn't. Both things simultaneously, the person she had been and the person the last 3 weeks had made her, overlaid in the dark glass of a window in a house no one was supposed to know about. Her son kicked again, sharp, insistent. I know, she said aloud. To no one. To him. I know, we're almost there. At 7:42 p.m., her prepaid phone lit up with a text from a number she didn't have saved. No name, no preamble. Just 4 words that made her hand tighten on the phone until her knuckles went white. He knows where you are. She was already moving before she finished reading it, the gym bag off the kitchen chair and onto her shoulder, her keys in her hand, the back door open, and the cold December air hitting her face and the dark driveway stretching in front of her toward the old blue car and whatever came next. She ran, not the panicked run of someone who has lost their head, the deliberate fast walk of a woman who is 7 months pregnant and cannot afford to fall, who understands that speed right now is less important than not going down on the gravel driveway in the dark. She kept her hand on the gym bag strap, kept her center of gravity low and forward, and got to the old blue car in 14 seconds. The engine turned on the first try. She had been grateful for that before. She was more grateful now. She went out the service gate at the back of the property rather than the main driveway. She had found it on her second walk around the perimeter that afternoon, a habit her father had given her before she could drive. Always know your second exit. And came out on a county road heading west with no lights behind her, at least not yet. She drove for 4 minutes before she let herself think. The text had been from a number she didn't recognize, which meant either a warning from someone inside Lorenzo's operation who was not fully committed to the outcome, or a manipulation designed to flush her from cover and onto a road where she could be more easily tracked. She held both possibilities and drove and watched her mirrors and decided it didn't matter which one was true because in either case, staying in the house had become the wrong choice, and she had made the right choice by leaving. And now the question was where? She couldn't go to Lena's office. Too obvious, too connected to her name and whatever information Lorenzo had. She couldn't go to a hotel because a credit card left a record and she didn't have enough cash for a full night. She couldn't drive aimlessly because she was 29 weeks pregnant and had been awake most of the previous 2 nights, and her body was beginning to present her with its own list of grievances. A deep ache across her lower back that had started on the drive to Napa and hadn't stopped, and a tightness across her belly that came and went in a way she was trying not to count. She called Lena from the prepaid, one hand on the wheel. "I had to leave the Napa property," she said. "Someone made the location." A pause. Then, "Where are you now?" "County road heading west, 20 minutes from the highway." "Okay." She could hear Lena moving, the sound of a chair and then heels on a hard floor. "I have a paralegal, Gwen Santos. She lives in Petaluma. I trust her completely. She's never intersected with any DeLuca or Caro business. Take 101 North and I'll text you her address. You can be there in 40 minutes. Did you file? 45 minutes ago, Judge Harmon signed the emergency asset freeze at 7:21. It's in the system. Every account tied to Lorenzo DeLuca and every entity I could connect to Caro's operation has been flagged." Lena's voice had the particular texture of someone who has accomplished something significant and has not yet allowed themselves to feel it. Lorenzo's attorneys got service notification at 7:58. 7:58. The text had come in at 7:42. 16 minutes before Lorenzo's people received legal notice of the freeze, which meant the text had not come from someone reacting to the filing. It had come from someone already watching the Napa house. Someone had known the address before the filing made anything official. "Renata," Isabella said. Not an accusation. A piece of the picture clicking into a place she didn't want it to be. Lena understood immediately. "You think she gave up the location?" "I think Caro has more reach than she knew, or more reach than she told me. She kept her eyes on the road, on the mirrors. It doesn't change tonight, but I need you to know that the Napa address is burned." "Understood. I'll text you Gwen's address. Get there, rest, and be ready. We have a lot of Monday coming at us very fast." Isabella pocketed the phone and drove north and did not look at the low ache across her back, because looking at it would make it larger than she could afford for it to be right now. Gwen Santos was 28 years old and had the energy of someone who does not require context to act. She opened her apartment door in Petaluma at 9:43 p.m., looked at Isabella, 7 months pregnant, gym bag, a face that had clearly been running on adrenaline and very little else for approximately 72 hours, and said, "Guest room's at the end of the hall, bathroom next to it. I'll make food. Do you have allergies?" "No," Isabella said. "Okay, go sit down." She ate scrambled eggs and toast at Gwen's kitchen table and felt something unknot slightly in her chest. Not safety, exactly, because safety was not a concept that applied to her life at this precise moment, but the specific relief of being in a space that smelled like someone's ordinary life, someone's dishes and coffee maker, and a calendar on the wall with a dentist appointment circled in green. She slept 6 hours. It was the most she had slept consecutively in 3 weeks. She woke at 4 a.m. with the backache resolved and the belly tightness gone, and her mind immediately operational, already running the sequence of what Monday morning required. She lay in the dark of Gwen's guest room and ran it twice to make sure she had it, and then she got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table where she had eaten eggs and wrote, in the notebook, everything she intended to say. She had never testified in a legal proceeding. She had never been in a boardroom as anything other than the CEO's wife, the Moretti daughter, decorating a chair at the long table, smiling and quiet, and so thoroughly overlooked that she had once sat through a 2-hour board meeting during which her father's company was discussed, and no one had once addressed her directly. She had been 19 then, and it had embarrassed her. She understood now that it was the most useful education she had ever received, to know what it felt like to be looked past, so that when the moment came to be looked at, she would know exactly how much it cost to hold someone's gaze and not look away. She wrote for an hour and a half. Then she put the notebook down and called Marco. He answered from what sounded like a hotel room, the specific acoustic flatness of carpeted spaces. The emergency session convened last night, he said, before she could ask. 7 directors. I invoked Article 12 and my attorney documented the basis. Lorenzo tried to reach 3 of the directors before the session. They told me after. He paused. He didn't succeed. The session. What was decided? A formal hold on all executive decisions pending review of the financial irregularities I presented, which means the wire transfers can't clear, she said. Any transfer above $50,000 requires board co-signature until the hold is lifted. The bank was notified last night. His voice went quiet. Lorenzo's attorneys called my attorney at 11 p.m. They're calling it an improper convening. They're going to challenge the Article 12 invocation. Let them challenge it, Isabella said. The board co-signature requirement is in the charter. It doesn't require the session to be uncontested. It just requires a quorum, and you had 7. She paused. Marco, thank you. Silence on his end. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. The stripped quality of someone who has paid for something and is still feeling the price. Is there anything of him that I got wrong? He said. Any part of this that I'm... He stopped. Any part I'm misreading? She thought about Lorenzo's hand on her stomach when the baby kicked and Lorenzo laughing, surprised. She thought about yellow flowers on a Saturday afternoon. She thought about 6 years of a marriage that had been, in some rooms and in some hours, genuinely inhabited. No, she said, you're not misreading it. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Then, okay, I'll be at the hearing at 10. She got to the courthouse at 9:20. Lena was already there with 2 associates and a banker's box of documents, and the focused, unhurried energy of someone who has been preparing for this specific morning for a very long time and is ready for it to arrive. She looked at Isabella, dressed, composed, her father's watch on her wrist, and gave a short nod that contained its own complete communication. They had a conference room for 30 minutes before the hearing. Lena walked her through the sequence: asset freeze confirmation, forgery authentication report, the Caro communications from the USB drive, which Lena's digital forensics contact had authenticated overnight, and the financial reconstruction, which 2 independent forensic accountants had signed off on at 2 a.m. that morning, working through the night on the figures Isabella had reconstructed from memory and Elena had delivered on the drive before Lena's Boston contact got her to safety. He'll have 3 attorneys, Lena said. They're going to challenge the drive's chain of custody because you removed it from his property. It was in a safe in a house I lived in for 6 years, Isabella said. My name is on the deed. I know. They know I know. The challenge will fail. They're making it to buy time and rattle you. Lena looked at her. Will it rattle you? No, Isabella said. Good. She closed the folder. One more thing. Lorenzo has filed a counter-motion, parental rights regarding the child. He's claiming you've created an unstable environment and requesting supervised visitation protocols pending the birth. She watched Isabella's face. It won't succeed, but I need you to be ready to hear it in that room. Isabella kept her face where it was. I'm ready, she said. The hearing room was smaller than she expected. Not a courtroom, an administrative hearing chamber, a long table with a judge at the head and chairs on both sides, and a woman in the corner with a transcription machine. Judge Harmon was in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she looked at the 2 tables with the particular neutrality of someone who has seen this dynamic many times and does not require it to surprise her to take it seriously. Lorenzo came in at 9:58 with his 3 attorneys. Isabella had not seen him since Saturday morning. It had been 36 hours, and they felt both very long and very precise, the way time feels when a lot of irreversible things have happened inside it. He came in without looking at her. She noticed that, the deliberate quality of not looking, the way you don't look at something because looking at it costs you something you've decided not to spend, and sat at the opposite table in a charcoal suit she recognized and set his hands flat on the table and looked at the judge. Then he looked at Isabella. She held his gaze. She held it for 5 full seconds, long enough that it was a thing, long enough that the attorneys on both sides registered it. And then she looked back at Judge Harmon, and she did not look at Lorenzo again for the next hour and 40 minutes. The hearing proceeded with the methodical momentum of a well-prepared legal case moving through a framework designed for exactly this situation. Lena was precise and unemotional and thorough in a way that left no visible opening. The asset freeze was confirmed, citing the forensic accounting report. The forgery authentication was entered into evidence, and Lorenzo's lead attorney objected on procedural grounds that Judge Harmon overruled in 11 words with no visible impatience. The Caro communications were entered, and the chain of custody challenge was raised and addressed and dismissed in the way Lena had predicted. With the brisk efficiency of an argument, everyone in the room understood was losing before it finished. Lorenzo's attorneys made their case for dissolving the freeze. It was competent. It was not enough. What happened at the 1 hour and 4 minute mark was not in the sequence Lena had outlined. One of Lena's associates handed her a document she read with no change in expression, and then approached the bench and handed it to Judge Harmon, and the judge read it and looked up and said, "Counselor, this is a federal notification." "Yes, Your Honor. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit filed its own asset hold at 9:47 this morning, tied to an investigation that has been ongoing for 14 months and which intersects with the material before this court." Lena returned to her table. "The federal hold supersedes the civil proceeding on the question of the offshore accounts." The room was quiet. FBI, 14 months. Isabella sat with that number moving through her. 14 months, which meant the federal investigation had begun a full 8 months before Thanksgiving night, which meant that whatever she had built in 3 weeks had been running parallel to something larger, something that had been assembling itself in the dark while she was loading the dishwasher and making dinner and lying awake in the monitored house. She thought about the voice on the recording she hadn't recognized. The Moretti transfer? Pending. It has to look voluntary. She thought about what kind of man arranges a marriage as a financial instrument, and does it carefully enough that the instrument works for 6 years without detection. She thought about what kind of operation attracts federal attention that runs for 14 months. She thought about Vincent Caro's name at the top of that investigation, almost certainly. The accounts, the offshore routing, the network of shell companies. Not just Lorenzo's scheme, but something much older and much larger that Lorenzo had been the domestic arm of. The respectable face, the man with the right name and the right marriage and the right access. Lorenzo's lead attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, my client has not been notified of any federal—" "He has been now," Judge Harmon said. She was looking at Lorenzo with the neutral interest of a woman reading a document that is clarifying rather than surprising. "Mr. DeLuca, I'd strongly recommend you confer with your counsel." Lorenzo said nothing. He was looking at the federal notification document that his attorney had just passed to him, and whatever his face normally did, whatever performance it ran automatically, was not running. He was looking at the document, and he was just a man at a table with paper in his hands, and the specific stillness of someone who has been running a long race and has just understood, not gradually but all at once, that the finish line is not where he thought it was. He looked up. He looked at Isabella. She was already looking at him. She had been waiting for this moment without knowing she was waiting for it. Not for satisfaction, exactly, because the feeling in her chest was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated and less clean than that, the feeling of looking at a person you loved, or believed you loved, or experienced something that functioned as love for, across a room in which everything they built together was being systematically and legally disassembled. His face said something she would never be able to accurately describe. It lasted less than 4 seconds. Then his attorney leaned close, and Lorenzo looked away, and she was done looking at him too. The hearing concluded at 11:40. The civil asset freeze was maintained pending the federal proceedings. The parental rights counter-motion was tabled pending resolution of the fraud case, with Judge Harmon noting on the record that the filing appeared to be tactically rather than substantively motivated, which she said in the flat legal language of the proceedings, but which meant what it meant. Lena gathered her documents and her associates gathered theirs, and Isabella stood and picked up her bag and walked out of the hearing room with the careful, deliberate gait of a woman in her 3rd trimester who is also not going to let her legs shake in a courthouse hallway. She made it to the women's restroom. She stood at the sink with the water running cold over her wrists and breathed. It was not over. She knew it was not over. There would be federal proceedings and civil proceedings, and the question of Adrian Viscari's role and Caro's arrest, and Lorenzo's sentencing, and a divorce that would take months, and a child who needed to be born into whatever came after all of this. It was not over. But the thing that had needed to be irreversible was irreversible. The asset freeze held. The federal hold was in place. The reserve accounts, her father's accounts, the ones built over a lifetime and nearly taken in the margin of a handwritten note, were frozen in place, untouched, waiting for the legal process to return them to where they belonged. She turned off the water. She dried her hands on a paper towel. She looked at her face in the mirror, really looked, the way she had looked at her reflection in the kitchen window on Thanksgiving night. And what she found looking back at her was recognizable in a way it hadn't been for weeks, or possibly for much longer than weeks. She went out to where Lena was waiting in the hallway. "Federal case takes how long?" she said. "For someone at Caro's level with this volume of evidence, 2 years minimum before trial." Lena fell into step beside her. "Lorenzo's cooperation options depend on how much he knows about Caro's broader operation. The FBI will approach him. Whether he talks determines a lot of what his next decade looks like." "And the Moretti assets?" "The freeze protects them during the federal proceeding. Your claim to the reserve accounts is strong. The forgeries void the transfer attempts, and the inheritance structure your father set up predates the marriage by 30 years. I don't see a credible challenge to your standing as primary beneficiary." She paused. "It will take time, but they're yours." Isabella nodded. They walked out of the courthouse into December afternoon light, thin and cold and without warmth but present, the kind of light that is still technically light even when it gives you very little. She stood on the steps and breathed the cold air and let it be cold. Marco was at the bottom of the steps. He had come and he had stayed, which she had not expected, and when she came down to where he was standing, he looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has done one correct thing in the middle of a series of wrong ones and is not sure what he's owed for it. "Nothing from the board?" she said. "I resigned my directorship this morning," he said. "Before the hearing, my attorney submitted it to the board chair." He paused. "I should have done a lot of things differently." "Yes," she said. She did not add anything to it because he didn't need her to, and because the things he should have done differently were not a debt she was collecting. She needed her energy for other things. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. "Gia knows," he said. "I told her everything last night. She said she'd been waiting for something like this for 4 years, and she just didn't know what it was going to look like." His voice went thin at the edges. "I think we're going to be all right. Eventually." "I hope so," Isabella said. And she meant it. The way you mean something that is true, but exists at a distance from where you are currently standing. He left. She stood on the courthouse steps for another minute, and then she called Elena. "It held," she said. Elena cried. She had not expected that. Elena, who was the steadier of the two of them, who had packed a bag and driven to Framingham without falling apart, Elena cried in a way that was brief and complete, and then was over. "Come to Boston," she said when she'd finished. "Come and stay with me until the baby comes. Marcus is home next week. We have room." "I can't leave California right now," Isabella said. "Legal process." "After the legal process." She thought about it. She thought about Elena's guest room and Marcus's bad jokes, and the particular quality of being in a space where people knew her before any of this and still knew her now, where she was not a Moretti heir or a DeLuca wife or a legal proceeding or a victim of a 9-year fraud, but just Isabella, who had loved bad coffee and her father's watch and sleeping in on Saturdays. "After the legal process," she said. Adrian Viscari called that evening. She was at a hotel Lena had arranged, a room under Lena's firm's account, no connection to her name, and she was in the chair by the window with her shoes off when the phone rang and his name came up on the prepaid. She looked at it for 3 rings. She answered. "Isabella." His voice was what it had always been, worn and reliable, and it made something in her chest contract with the specific pain of a betrayal that was more complicated than the straightforward kind. "I need to tell you something." "I know what you're going to tell me," she said. "Let me say it anyway." A pause, and she heard him breathing, the careful breath of an old man finding words. "Caro contacted me 6 weeks ago. He had my son's financial records. Marcus has Marcus made some decisions with other people's money that he shouldn't have. Caro knew every detail. Another pause. He told me if I cooperated, he would make those records disappear. He told me if I didn't, your son would be prosecuted, she said. Yes. She looked out the hotel window at the city at night. What did you give him? The address in Napa. Your meeting with Lena Park. Not the contents. I didn't have the contents. Just the name. His voice had the quality of a man who is not asking for forgiveness and knows he doesn't deserve to ask. I told myself it was small enough that it wouldn't. He stopped. That's not good enough. No, she said. It isn't. Silence. Your son, she said. His situation. Is it resolvable? With competent counsel and cooperation, yes, the amounts are recoverable. It's not criminal at the level that's... Give his information to Lena Park, she said. Tell her I sent you. She'll connect you with someone who handles this without touching the federal case. She paused. That's not forgiveness. I'm not ready to decide what it is yet. But Marcus doesn't carry your choices. She heard him exhale. It was the exhale of a man setting down something very heavy. Thank you, he said. Isabella. Not tonight, she said. Good night, Adrian. She hung up and sat with it for a while. There was no version of this that was clean. She had understood that intellectually for weeks, and was only now understanding it in her body, in the particular exhaustion of a person who has fought something large and won the essential parts, and still has to live in the aftermath of all the smaller losses. Adrian's compromise, Marco's years of willful ignorance, Renata's divided loyalties, Lorenzo's face in the hearing room with the federal document in his hands. None of it resolved into something simple. The people who had failed her had done so for reasons that were small and human and did not excuse anything, and also did not render them into villains without remainder. The person who had most completely betrayed her had done so for a love she now knew was partly designed and partly real, and the partly real was the part that would take the longest to metabolize. She ordered room service. She ate it in the chair by the window. She called no one else that night. What followed was not swift, and it was not graceful. The federal proceedings moved on the timeline Lena had described. 2 years in which there were depositions and filings and a civil divorce that moved through the courts with the grinding pace of a process involving contested assets and a child's interests and the intersection of domestic law with a federal criminal case. Lorenzo cooperated with the FBI. In the end, cooperated substantively, giving them the architecture of Caro's operation in detail, extensive enough that Caro's arrest in the spring came with 47 separate charges. Whether Lorenzo did this out of calculation or something else, Isabella never knew and stopped trying to determine. Her son was born on a Tuesday in February during a sleet storm that iced the hospital parking lot and made her sister 40 minutes late, which Elena would apologize for until the child was old enough to find it funny. He was born efficiently and not without pain, arriving in the way second-generation Moretti things tended to arrive, with determination and some noise and a complete indifference to whether the timing was convenient. She named him Domenico. She had made that decision in the kitchen on Thanksgiving night without knowing she'd made it, and by February it was simply the truth of what his name was going to be. She brought him home to the apartment she had leased in the city in January. Her own place, her name on the lease, furniture she had chosen, no marble countertops, no pendant lighting selected from a catalog in someone else's aesthetic. It was small and had good light in the mornings, and a window in the kitchen that looked out on a courtyard where someone had planted a lemon tree that seemed genuinely committed to surviving the winter. Lorenzo saw his son twice before the criminal sentencing. Both visits were supervised, per the court order, in a room with a family services coordinator and a camera. The first time he held Domenico, his face did something she chose not to interpret. She sat across the room and watched, and did not leave and did not interfere, and did not help him with the specific difficulty of holding a small person he had not been there to meet, arriving in the world. The second visit, he said, to the room in general, not quite looking at her. The way it started, that wasn't the whole of it. She understood what he meant. She was not sure it was true, and she was not sure it mattered whether it was true. I know, she said, because she had already decided, not for him but for herself, that she was not going to spend the next decade arguing the interior of a dead marriage with a man who was going to federal prison. I was sentenced in the fall to 7 years, reduced for cooperation. Caro received 23 and would not see the outside of a federal facility before he was 83 years old, if he lived that long. The Moretti assets were returned to Isabella's control in the spring following the divorce settlement. The process was exactly as long and grinding as Lena had said it would be, and not one day shorter. When the final transfer cleared and Lena called to confirm it, Isabella was in the courtyard of her apartment building with Domenico in the stroller, watching him look at the lemon tree with the focused incomprehension of a 3-month-old encountering the concept of yellow. "It's done," Lena said. "Thank you," Isabella said. She put the phone in her pocket and crouched down beside the stroller and looked at her son, who looked back at her with the dark eyes he had inherited from the Moretti side and the mouth that was also Moretti, and the hands that were larger than they had any right to be on a person this small. He had no idea what his first months had cost, what had been built and broken and rebuilt to get him to this particular Tuesday morning with his stroller in a courtyard and a lemon tree to look at. He would not know for many years, and she intended to be very careful about how she told him, not to protect him from the truth, but to give him enough time to become a person with enough structure to hold it. She straightened up and pushed the stroller once around the courtyard, and then sat on the bench against the south wall where the morning light was strongest, and tilted her face up to it and let it be warm on her skin. She thought about her father. She thought about the charity gala 9 years ago, and the man who had been sent to find her, and the life that had grown up around that engineered meeting. Real in some rooms, hollow in others, and everywhere complicated by the fact that human things cannot be entirely manufactured, even by people who are trying to manufacture them. She thought about yellow flowers on a Saturday afternoon. She thought about Thanksgiving night, and a phone on a counter, and the 30-second mistake that had given her the only weapon she had needed. She thought about what her father had said when she was 16 and furious about something small. The most dangerous thing you can ever do to an enemy is let them believe you haven't figured out what they are. He had been right. He was usually right. She was glad she had remembered it when she needed it, and she was glad he had told her, and she was glad she had been the kind of person who kept the things people told her in a place where they could be found again when the ground shifted. Domenico made a sound, not crying, just the beginning of the pre-cry escalation that she had learned to distinguish from the actual thing. And she leaned over the stroller and offered him her finger, and he took it and held it with the absolute grip of someone who has very recently figured out that grip is available to them and intends to use it. She let him hold it. She looked at the lemon tree in the late morning light, winter stripped and stubborn in its pot, putting out its few yellows against the cold with no particular concern for whether the season was appropriate. She did not think about the boardroom. She did not think about the hearing. She did not go back over the sequence of decisions and play the game of which one had been the one that mattered most, because she knew from watching her father that that game had no end, and the people who played it longest were the ones who forgot to live in the time the game was consuming. She was 32 years old. She had a son and a company and a lemon tree to look at on Tuesday mornings, and the work ahead of her was significant and real and entirely hers. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She sat in the courtyard light with her son's grip around her finger until he fell asleep. And then she sat a little longer because the light was good and she had nowhere to be that was more important than this. And she had learned, expensively, completely, without any soft edges, that the moments you sit in when you have nowhere more important to be are exactly the moments that make the rest of it worth what it cost.